Audio check, 1, 2. Okay, if we can reconvene. Mr. Morehouse, are you all right doing it from all the way back there?
I am, yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Can
think
you
it's
double mic as well, just so we...
Sorry, use both?
Yes.
Of course.
It just helps with the acoustics in here.
Thank you.
So, okay.
I can see Mr. Williams. Good afternoon. I hope you can see me. I think depending on where my learned friend Mr. Humphreys sits, it sometimes varies.
I can't now.
Thank you. I think I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. Just wait till you get settled. And... Mr. Morehouse.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, I just want to pick up on a theme that started by my learned friend Mr. Taylor about changes since the planning application was originally submitted. A lot of evidence was given before the lunch adjournment about the numbers of people affected by the proposed changes. Since the planning application was first put in, are you aware of the granting of planning permissions for the building of residences, houses in the area underneath the flight path?
I'm not aware of any, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. I wouldn't know.
I think the permission's been granted for an additional 170 homes in the Yatton area, Congresbury, Winford, 21 houses, Congresbury, 25 houses, a total of, I think, 265 new homes in that area. You weren't aware of that?
No.
And so, so far as the figures that have been discussed today, should those areas, should those houses fall within the affected areas, if I can put it that way, that you've covered, they ought to be added to the total numbers of people affected by the proposal?
Yes, so the numbers that we've discussed are all based on the same population data set and dwelling data set that was used for the original environmental statement to enable consistency.
But just as we factor in things like changes to noise going ahead, we also need to factor in additional housing and the like in these areas, don't we?
Yes, although obviously any newly built dwellings should have regard for the airport already existing and hopefully be suitably insulated against noise.
Yes, and of course, since the application was refused, people have gone ahead and granted permission for another 265 houses in the area. So now, by the same token, the airport now has to have regard to that, don't they?
Yes, so what I mean is in terms of the existing airport, as in up to 10 million.
I just wonder whether you can have a look at the aviation policy document. I think it's CD 6.1. And if people can, I want to draw your attention to the policy objective, paragraph 312, which is page 57 of the PDF.
Yes.
The government's overall policy on aviation noise is to limit and, where possible, reduce the number of people in the UK significantly affected by aircraft noise. And you've been discussing this morning as part of a policy of sharing the benefits of noise reduction with industry. Yes? There's no disagreement with that as the government's policy objective. 313, this is consistent with the government's noise policy as set out in the noise policy statement. which aims to avoid significant adverse impact on health and quality of life. No disagreement with that.
No?
And then paragraph 319, the aviation policy framework. Average noise exposure contours are a well-established measure of annoyance and are important to show historic trends in total noise around airports. However, the government recognises that people do not experience noise in an averaged manner, and that the value of the LAEQ indicator does not necessarily reflect all aspects of the perception of aircraft noise, and for this reason, we recommend that average noise contours should not be the only measure used when airports seek to explain how locations under flight paths are affected by aircraft noise. And then it goes on to encourage the use of other measures. So do we agree that whilst LAEQ is an important measure, in fact, government policy suggests that you ought to be looking at other measures?
Yes, broadly, I think what that paragraph says in terms of my interpretation is that you should be using LAEQ, and then that other metrics help to explain the noise, as in they aid understanding, rather than that you should use them specifically to assess the impact.
It goes further than that, doesn't it? In fact, it tells you that you ought to be looking at other metrics. For this reason, we recommend that average noise contours should not be the only measure. So the government policy is you should be looking at other measures.
Well, I think, as I just said, the second half of that sentence is when you seek to explain how locations under flight paths are affected.
Yeah.
So as in explaining, not assessing, which I think is an important distinction.
Paragraph 334. This is at page 62. The government recognises that the cost on local communities are higher from aircraft noise during the night, particularly the health costs associated with sleep disturbance. Noise from aircraft at night is therefore widely regarded as the least acceptable aspect of flight operations. However, we also recognise the importance to the UK economy of certain types of flights, such as express freight services, which may only be viable if they operate at night. The destinations operated by Bristol Airport aren't express freight services either, they're tourist operations.
As far as I know, yes.
And we see at paragraph 335, don't we, an example being given of the application of the policy or the approach to the policy, and recognising these higher costs upon local communities. We expect the aviation industry to make extra efforts to reduce and mitigate noise from night flights through the use of best-in-class aircraft, best practice operating procedures, seeking ways to provide respite wherever possible, and minimising the demand for night flights where alternatives are available. And they go on to commend the voluntary approach adopted at Heathrow, ensuring that early morning arrivals don't land before 4:30 a.m. That appears to be a fairly clear steer, doesn't it, from the government in relation to the reduction of the impact of night flights on local residents, doesn't it?
I think they're clear that where possible, they would prefer there to be less flights at night, yes.
And the proposal being advanced in this case, which involves the proposed removal of the cap of the 4,000 night flights, limiting them to the distribution between summer and winter, that's going in the opposite direction, isn't it?
The cap on the number of flights is yes, although the quota count scheme, which limits the total noise produced by those flights, is actually getting slightly tighter. So the overall impacts should stay the same or reduce.
The figures that you have produced, they are based upon readings which haven't, which essentially are an assessment of the noise impact on the areas concerned, rather than actually a validated measurement of those areas.
as discussed before, the model was validated based on measurements at the noise monitoring terminals. You're correct, we've not measured at everybody's house, if that's what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And so far as the airport is concerned, from the perspective of people who are suffering from the flights that are taking place, the baseline that we're looking at and the impact on individual people, essentially up to 2019, was up to a, well, based on flights, around about 9 mppa, wasn't it? 9 million passengers per year.
Off the top of my head, yes, I think they were just below 9 million in 2019.
Just below, because even though planning permission exists for 10 million people, it wasn't fully utilised.
Yes.
And so by granting permission for up to 12 million people, if that in fact is utilised, the permission effectively could increase the number of flights, or passengers anyway, by up to a third over the pre-existing levels. Of what people were experiencing. People
obviously, an increase of 3 from 9 is about a third, but yes, that's not all due to the permission, as you've just said. They already had permission to go up to 10.
They had permission to go up to 10, but I'm talking about from the point of view of what people on the ground are experiencing. It could be up to a third more flights than they were up to the pre-pandemic level, just short of 9 million MP.
Yes.
And Bristol Airport has difficulties with expansion, doesn't it? It has a short runway compared to other airports.
Compared to some other airports, yes.
I don't know whether you were able to hear the evidence of one of the contributors to the inquiry in the first week who commented that compared to other airports, she's overlaid a map on her house compared to another airport project, and she would have been on the runway of the other airport where her house is in relation to the airport. Houses are very close to Bristol Airport, aren't they? Many houses.
I'm not sure I'd call it many, but some are relatively close, as is the case at a lot of airports.
And Bristol Airport doesn't have the advantage of, for example, Heathrow Airport, of being able to add additional runways so that you can disperse the takeoff the volume of aircraft taking off.
Well, it's not necessary that Heathrow can add runways at the moment. We're seeing they're struggling to do that, but yes, Bristol only has one runway. It has one runway,
and that runway, unlike, for example, Cardiff, always takes off over land. Cardiff, for example, flights can take off or land over the Bristol Channel, can't they?
If you say so. I'm not intricately familiar with Cardiff Airport, but yes.
Okay. And so the result of an intensification of use means that essentially what we would be looking at is cramming more aircraft onto the existing runway, takeoff times becoming more frequent, both night and day.
Yes, there would be more flights. That's clear.
I wonder if you can have a look now at document 17.1, which is the PCAA evidence document produced by Hilary Byrne, page 80.
So page 80 or
page
18?
80.
80.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that a flight schedule?
That's a flight schedule for the arrivals overnight, the 18th to the 19th of July 2018. We can see there, under the existing relationship, I think there's a highlighted paragraph, flights from 8th of September 2018 from 0010 10 past midnight. Do you see that identified as the blue line? Line. And so below that, we've got flights coming in from Naples, Faro, 10 past and 35 minutes past midnight, 5 minutes to 1 in the morning, 1:15. Each of these flights is going to be waking up potentially or interfering with the sleep pattern of people living in that area, aren't they?
Potentially, yes.
Alicante 1:15, Malaga 1:30. We go over the page to the next one, Malaga 2:45 in the morning, Dalaman 4:10 a.m. and then 4:25 a.m. So the pre-existing position, which before any intensification of flights, regular flights which you accept would be disturbing of the sleep of people living close to the airport.
I accept that some people would be disturbed by them, yes.
Do you think an intensification of the number of night flights is going to assist that position?
No.
I wonder if you can go to page 85, please, of that same document. I don't know whether you've seen this before. Paragraph 2.3, which sets out a complaint and the response to the complaint from Bristol Airport. The response to the complaint being disturbance from aircraft. Thank you for contacting Bristol Airport Noise Complaint Service regarding disturbance from aircraft. Your concerns have been logged and will be included in our statistics, which are publicly reported to the Airport Consultative Committee. I've logged your recent complaint about noise levels on the 30th of July 2018. In response to your questions, the average decibel levels between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. and 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. at the Congressbury Noise Monitor were as follows. We can see there between 6 and 7 a.m. the total LEQ was 62.3, and the aircraft LEQ being a contributor of 61.2. Now, this morning we were discussing the impact of aircraft noise. The LEQ level is a measure of the energy effectively emitted over that hour-long period, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
And made up, the components of that are, we can see there, the aircraft LEQ count, 17 aircraft contributing to that. Each aircraft is going to be significantly noisier than the average, isn't it? And then you'll have quieter periods in between.
Yes.
So just to understand what is going on between that 6 to 7 a.m. period, we've got 17 aircraft. The average LEQ is 61.2. This is in Congressbury. So every 3.5 minutes, there, on average, in that hour, there is an aircraft flying overhead. Yes?
Yes, something like that.
60 minutes divided by 17, unless my maths is wrong. So every 3.5 minutes over that period, over that hour-long period, the average coming out at 61.2 LEQ. That means if an aircraft is taking about 30 seconds to go overhead, that means every 3.5 minutes, 30 seconds of that time, people won't be able to speak, people won't be able to use their telephones, watch television, listen to the radio. That's the impact of that, isn't it?
Other than sleeping, I'm not sure they're necessarily activities you'd be doing at 6 o'clock in the morning.
It would wake people up, wouldn't it?
The noise level is associated with sleep disturbance for some people. Admittedly, it's 60 L max rather than LEQ, and they're not directly comparable. But, yes.
Maybe the people who've been woken up have their sleep disturbed between 6 and 7 a.m. will be awake between 7 and 8 a.m., where we've got an aircraft LEQ of 60.2, 14 aircraft flying in that hour. So one every 4 minutes, they would be suffering a similar impact on their lives, wouldn't they?
The LEQ is similar in 627 and 728, if that's what you're asking.
Now, if the airport is permitted to fly a third additional aircraft, a third more than we're currently contributing to that sort of level, there are a number of options, aren't there? There will either be more flights taking off in that very busy period, or that very busy period gets longer, doesn't it?
Presumably, yes.
And so either where there's a reduction from 7 till 8 to 3 aircraft taking off, we might have more aircraft taking off in that time, or instead of every 3.5 minutes, we'll have another third of flights going through between, say, 6 and 7 or 7 and 8.
Yes, there would be more. I don't know exactly how they would be distributed.
We've heard evidence that takes place from the point of view of the residents. Those peak spots happen early in the morning, 6 o'clock through to 8 o'clock, at lunchtime, and then in the evenings. Those are times when people would normally be stopping for food, rest, coming home and watching television, relaxing. It's important for people to be able to do that, isn't it?
In general, it's important for people to be able to relax, yes.
And so, and we've also heard that there is very often an intensification of those flights, particularly in the summer over weekends, so that those periods of time are longer over weekends than they are, and the interference longer over weekends than they are in the weekday. It's important for people to be able to have a rest on the weekend, isn't it?
In general terms, I'm not an expert on health, but it's presumably related to good health.
So we get a better understanding, don't we, where if we just rely on the LAEQ metrics as to, and don't take into account the number and frequency of noise events, the sort of impact it's having on day-to-day life for people living in those areas, don't we?
Well, I think the LAQ metric does take into account all of these things. I mean, the profile of flights is similar at many UK airports. It's not something that's specific to Bristol. So I think the results from social surveys in relation to LEQ would be valid at Bristol as well.
And the LAEQ 16 is an average over the day, but we can agree, can't we, if we look at the Bristol Airport response to the complaint, that what we've actually got is a 2-hour prolonged period where the aircraft LEQ, the total LEQ, 62.3 and 64.7, when you combine the impacts on people. We've got a 2-hour period in the morning where there's a significantly higher level.
I mean, obviously there'll be some hours where you've got a higher level and some hours where you've got a lower level. That's the nature of an average.
Yes.
And as I said, the distribution over the day is common to many airports. So I don't see why that should specifically affect Bristol differently.
No, but we agree that early in the morning, lunchtime, in the evenings are significant times in most people's daily lives, aren't they, to live in their homes and enjoy their homes.
I wouldn't tell people specifically what time they're meant to be enjoying their homes.
Okay. Now, what I'm interested in also understanding is in your errata to the proof of evidence, I think you produced some corrected tables, and one of them on page 3 I'm just looking at, which is where you make reference to the affected properties, applying the noise exposure hierarchy. Page 3 of your, it's corrected ESA table 6A1 is the heading. I've got ESA at the top left.
Yes.
That is a table which I think the top left of the table is the subjective description of impact, contour bands, etc. The subjective description of impact is reference to the noise exposure hierarchy, isn't it?
Yes.
And that subjective description of impact is one that presumably, as the report writer, you've been the person who's subjectively applied the assessment of whether or not which bracket people fall into.
Yes. I mean, it's not something that's unique to my report, but yes, that's...
Sorry?
It's not something that nobody else has ever used, I suppose, is the best.
Well,
I did.
You've created this table, haven't you? And you must have, when you created the table, decided which people were negligible, which people were very minor.
Yes, the descriptions have been assigned to noise levels, and I wrote the report. So I suppose I'm just making it clear that I've not created it specifically for this report. It's something that's been used in a number of other applications and assessments.
What I'd invite you to have a look at is CD 10.17, which is should be a British Medical Journal article. Have you got it?
Yes.
Yes, we can see there the abstract says it's the objective was to investigate whether exposure to aircraft noise increases the risk of hospitalization for cardiovascular disease in older people that's greater or equal to 65 years residing near airports. It was a multi-airport retrospective study of 6 million older people living near airports in the United States. And they superimpose contours of aircraft noise levels. So these are the aircraft contours that you would be using, that you've prepared in relation to Bristol Airport, aren't they? Similar methodology being employed.
We've calculated contours, if that's...
Yeah. For 89 airports for 2009, there were 6 million participants, just over that. And the main outcome measures percentage increase in the hospitalization admission rate for cardiovascular disease associated with a 10 decibel increase in aircraft noise for each airport, and on average airports across, adjusted by individual level characteristics, and looking at all sorts of other factors, pollution, roadway densities and the like. And the conclusions we can see there, despite limitations relating to potential misclassification of exposure, we found a statistically significant association between exposure to aircraft noise and the risk of hospitalization for cardiovascular disease amongst older people living near the airport. And just so we get a better understanding of what it is that people are talking about, if we turn to page 5 of that document, and look at the third paragraph down, which starts, "Our study suggests." It says here, "Our study suggests that although an exposure response relation exists between noise and cardiovascular admission rates, there may also be a threshold for the effect of noise exposure on cardiovascular disease hospitalizations. Results from our models using a categorized exposure variable showed consistent statistical significant associations in only the highest exposure group, that is greater than 55 decibels. These findings are broadly consistent with previous literature." And then it carries on below that. In a categorical analysis, Huss and colleagues observed significant mortality from myocardial infarction with aircraft noise only in the highest group of 60 decibels A weighted or more. Other studies found associated with hypertension outcomes at levels of 50 decibels or more. So that's a peer-reviewed article in the British Medical Journal based on the study of 6 million people living near to an airport. My question to you is, in relation to that, is would you consider that those medical conditions, so myocardial infarctions or cardiovascular problems, would be a medically definable harm?
Yes, obviously a heart attack is medically definable harm. I mean,
So if
I'm not familiar with this specifically, but it seems consistent with other research that at high noise levels you do have a small increase in your chance of medical conditions, which is the reason that high noise levels are set as a SOL, for example.
And the trigger point that they say for medically definable harm, if we agree that that is the case, appears to be for cardiovascular disease, 55 decibels.
That's what it says in this report. I don't know what metric they're using. I know in the United States they sometimes use some different metrics.
Yeah. So following on from that, because I was asking you about your subjective description of the impact in the table that you've prepared, did you take these factors into account when you were deciding which level to put the contour bands into and the exposure to people?
Did I take what into account specifically?
Did you take things like that medical research into account when you did that?
I didn't take this specific study into account. I've not read every single study that's been done into noise. There's hundreds every year, but we took into account research that's been done and published by the WHO, for example, yes.
There is a huge body of evidence. In fact, I suspect there's nothing that contradicts it. That there's a huge body of evidence, isn't there, medical evidence, that says 55 decibels and above, and you are getting into areas of medically definable harm.
Certainly at night, yes.
Sorry?
Certainly at night, which is why that's set as the SOL, yes.
We are trespassing a little bit into health, and obviously I'm
Yes.
aware that Val have got a health witness.
Yes, I am trying to relate it to the table that's been prepared and where people have been put in subjectively. I think Mr. Williams agreed in that table. So it is trying to understand what Mr. Williams has put in here and whether it's in fact.
Okay, I think if you can put it more into that context, then
Yes.
please.
But if we go back to your ESA table 6A1 and your errata proof,
Yes.
you've got the contour band 55 decibels as the subjective description of impact is moderate.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And we can have a look at research document 1018, CD 1018. This is a study of a Swiss study of myocardial infarctions, heart attacks associated with transportation noise and air pollution. 4.6 million people older than 30 years. And we can see their mortality increase with increasing level and duration of aircraft noise. The adjusted hazard ratio compared with greater or equal than 60 decibels and compared with less than 45 decibels was 1.3 overall. So again, aircraft noise, their conclusions, aircraft noise is associated with mortality from myocardial infarction with a dose-response relationship for level and duration of exposure. So increased aircraft noise is associated with increased MIs, myocardial infarctions. Yes? You
That's
agree
what-
with those conclusions? You agree that that's what it says? You're not qualified to comment on the conclusions?
Yes.
Well, there's
I
very little
agree
point
from
just
read.
putting in a series of documents and say, do you agree this is what it says? I mean,
Yes.
come on, let's actually cross-examine, not just
Well,
read stuff. There's a health witness coming who, you know, it may be appropriate to ask questions of. Mr. Williams is doing his absolute best to try and assist you, but
no,
you need to ask a question.
I can understand, Mr. Humphreys, that point of view, but this does again go to an understanding of what Mr. Williams has taken into account when he's prepared that table. If medically definable harm, if Mr. Williams accepts that myocardial infarctions are medically definable harm, then we are looking at an unacceptable adverse effect at a soul, which is a different way to the way he's categorized all of these households.
Obviously, having a heart attack is medically definable harm, but the increased risk in it is obviously what's important, and essentially what these studies generally show, which is why souls end up being set where they are, is that the risk isn't really proved at all below the soul, and then it starts to be linked with noise above the soul, and then obviously increases as you get to higher noise levels, which, as you say, would result in, at the highest level, being an unacceptable level.
And I don't know whether you, as part of your preparation of that material, spoke to any people or read any of the complaints of people living nearby about the sleep deprivation, psychological distress. I think one of the witnesses described being scratchy, which is irritable. Did you take any of that into account when you prepared your reports?
I didn't read their evidence before I did my assessment that predated their evidence, no.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Tudor, you had some questions for Mr. Williams in terms of tranquility specifically, is that correct? Can you turn your microphone on? Are you content to sit there? I'm not sure if you can see each other.
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
Okay. You just bend the microphone a bit further down.
If you could possibly just move around one seat, then I could actually see you.
Or if,
Or
can
both.
you, if, sorry.
Musical chairs this afternoon.
Thank you. No, it's because I've got my
Mr.
notes.
Williams, can you see?
Yes.
Is that okay? Okay. I'm not very, expert at being in this role, but anyway. So, Mr. Williams, do you or would you agree that the nationally designated area of outstanding natural beauty is a potential constraint to the expansion of Bristol International Airport, given government places great weight on the conservation and enhancement of AOMBs?
That's not really a question for a noise witness.
Well, I'm leading on. It's just that tranquility is a special quality of the AOMB, and tranquility, along with other special qualities, contribute to natural beauty, which obviously the government is keen to ensure we retain.
I'm sure there's no argument that tranquility is a contributing factor to an area of outstanding natural beauty. I think the question, the way you phrased it, was perhaps unfair for this witness. I take the point of what you're trying to get at. If you can keep it to tranquility and noise issues, I know it's difficult, I know, but if you can keep it to that, I think that's a fairer question for this witness. Obviously, in the Greenbelt and Landscape Week, the particular witnesses for that will be able to sort of be best placed to answer that.
Okay. Well, it's sort of keeping on the tranquility theme, but obviously with relation to the AOMB.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Mr. Fumicelli in his proof of evidence on page 64 in paragraph 4.96 indicates that the environmental statement and the AES are silent on the issue of tranquility and how the proposed scheme might impact and adversely affect tranquility in the locality of the airport, nearby rural areas and the Mendip Hills AOMB, only a few kilometres to the south of the airport. Now, I think that's a really interesting observation that Mr. Fumicelli's made. And going to Mr. Williams' proof of evidence, or rather, Mr. Williams' section on noise in the environmental statement, I look at table 7.14.
Which, do you have the reference number there and the...
I've not got the CD reference, but it's basically the, it's in the ES, and it's chapter 7, and the page number...
I think it's 2.5.16.
Okay, let's, if we can just pause
Yeah,
there,
sorry.
let me find it. Sorry, Mr. Williams, what did you say? It was
2.5.16, I think.
Okay.
And what page was it, sorry?
7.22.
Sorry, what page is that?
7.22, it's table 7.14.
Yes, okay, so PDF page 22. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So that's, that table refers to specific non-residential receptors, amenity areas. And I note that not one of those amenity areas is within the AOMB. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, the AOMB is exposed to comparatively very low noise levels that were quite a long way outside of our area of interest for noise.
But does that make sense? You're saying that you've not included areas within the AOMB because the noise levels were low?
Yes, I can see how that might not make sense initially. The assessment that we did, obviously, you generally are concerned with places where it's noisy and trying to see how that changes. There's no reason to expect that the noise level changes would be different outside of the area that we had assessed, and I think there was specific consideration of the AOMB in post-application discussions with NSC, which I don't have to hand, but I think are a core document, where we looked at the number of flights that would be going over there and the change in noise level. From memory, the number of flights was changing from something like 85 to 95 a day, for example.
Well, going on further to just crossing over again to Mr. Fumicelli's proof of evidence, we go to paragraph 4.98, and he's obviously carried out various calculations, etc. And in his conclusion, it states, "It is therefore considered inevitable that the tranquility of locations in the rural and small settlement locations where aircraft fly below 7,000 feet, which includes a significant proportion of the northern part of the Mendip Hills AOMB, as indicated in the images above." I mean, he's included images at figure 7 and figure 8, will be eroded to a greater degree than if the scheme did not go ahead.
Sorry, what's the question?
Well, do you agree with that?
I agree that they would be eroded to a greater degree than if the scheme did not go ahead. However, I would say the difference between the two is going to be so small as to potentially not be noticeable. For example, I did notice Mr. Fumicelli provided a method for assessing tranquility that gave a formula for how to take into account noise, and it multiplied the change in LAEQ by a factor of 0.1 something, which essentially means that as the changes are around 1 decibel or less, your change on a scale of 1 to 10 due to the change in noise would be less than 0.1. And I find it hard to believe that that would be the difference between something being tranquil and not being tranquil. I think in general there is a requirement to take tranquility into account when you're considering airspace changes, and this is particularly relevant because it can involve putting planes or routing planes where they don't currently fly. I think for an area that is currently considered to be tranquil, that already has planes flying over it, having a change of, let's say, 20%, give or take, in the number of planes, I think at a high level is quite unlikely to change the character of that area from being tranquil to not tranquil.
Yeah, but that gets me back to your Mr. Fumicelli's 4.96 that rightly points out that the environmental statement and the AES are silent on the issue of tranquility. It doesn't seem as if it's actually been dealt with transparently within the ES and AES.
Yes, we didn't consider tranquility specifically in the ES, although, as I mentioned, it was a question that North Somerset Council raised in post-application discussions, and we responded to their satisfaction on what the changes would be on the Mendip Hills AOMB.
Yeah, so it seems that tranquility wasn't looked at. And yet, I know this is probably not your thing, but in Mr. Melling's rebuttal, it says the ES and supplementary information provided by BAL to North Somerset has established that the appeal proposal will not result in adverse impacts on the AOMB.
Sorry, could I just ask if you could talk into the microphone? I can't really hear you.
Yeah, Mr. Melling's rebuttal proof at 52.10 states the environmental statement and supplementary information provided by BAL to North Somerset has established that the appeal proposal will not result in adverse impacts on the AOMB or its setting as a result of additional flights, road traffic or lighting. Now, if you've not dealt with tranquility within the environmental statement, how can you reach that conclusion?
So I don't have it right in front of me, but I think that probably refers to the information provided, as I was just mentioning, subsequent to the application as a result of discussions with NSC.
I think that might be something better to pick up with that particular witness.
I think that concludes my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Tudor. Okay, thank you. Mr. Ware, are you with us?
Yes, I think I'm with you.
There we go. You had some questions.
Yeah, Mr. Williams, I've just got a couple of points that I would like to clarify. The first one was probably a result of me having technical problems right at the beginning. If I can take you back to your discussion with Mr. Taylor, you were talking about the term beneficial receptors, and I think you agreed that that essentially meant that those individuals, those receptors, would experience no change. Do you remember that, way back at the beginning?
Yes, I think it's the other way around. Mr. Taylor was just clarifying that people that experience no change would put in the beneficial column, yes. Yeah,
so they went into the beneficial column, and I think it was then said that designation then flowed through a suite of tables. What I didn't get, and I think you were probably answering, but I couldn't catch it, I didn't get a feel for how many receptors, either in terms of number or percentage, that might apply to.
I don't know off the top of my head, but it was a small number, like less than 100, I'm sure. Probably single figures, possibly.
That's very useful. Thank you.
I can confirm it if that's useful.
No need. I was just trying to get a flavour for it, and I think at that point the technology let me down.
So, Mr. Ware, Mr. Humphreys has asked if they can confirm that point.
It seems sensible that we would try to find the number, and then we can give it to you, and we'll just produce it as a little sort of half-side note or something that just says it's this number.
Yep. That would be excellent. Okay, thanks very much for that. The other area I just wanted to touch on, and this may be me, but earlier on this afternoon, you were talking about the noise insulation scheme. There were figures given for the likely numbers of people who would qualify, and I realised that you said you weren't, it was an approximate figure of 500, and that's absolutely fine. What I'm trying to get my head around, though, is what the scheme might entail. The reason I'm saying that is that if you look at the environmental statement, it talks about the minimum specification of the ventilators. And indeed, when you were speaking, you were talking about the ventilators. If you look at the latest draft of the section 106 that I've seen, and it's probably moved on, the 106 draft talks about, as well as noise insulation measures, the scheme should include measures to provide alternative means of ventilation. So basically my question is, what is this insulation scheme? Is it a ventilator so that you can close the windows but still get air, or is it a noise insulation scheme?
So as it stands at the moment, as far as I understand it anyway, the scheme is that the homeowner gets a quote for works which can include windows and ventilation, but ultimately it's up to them exactly what they want to use the money for, as long as it's related. And there are minimum specifications for those elements of what they have to install.
So your figure, and I realise it's an approximation, I wouldn't hold you to it, but your figure of about £500 per household that you gave is for insulation and secondary ventilation?
No, that was only for the ventilator. So that's what I was asked.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think that was the price per ventilator, not per household.
Yes.
Price per ventilator. Do you have an equivalent figure of the price per replacement window?
It can be variable, but my understanding is that if there's no unusual circumstances such as access reasons or things like that, then in the region of £1,000, I think, per window. Again, depends on the size of the window as well.
Of course. Okay, that's very useful. Thanks very much, Mr. Williams.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Humphreys, re-examination. Do you have a rough time scale, please?
Madam, thank you. I would think sort of between 30 and 45 minutes.
Okay, all right. Are you content to continue, or did you want a comfort break?
No, I'm very content to
I was asking Mr. Williams, but thank you.
sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yes, we can carry on.
Okay, all right. We'll crack on then.
Didn't ask me.
Sorry, Mr. Humphreys. All right. Does anyone want a comfort break in the interest of fairness? No. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Williams, I'm going to take you back over various of the things that you were asked about, and I won't succeed wholly, but I'm going to try to pull things together into themes. So although it's broadly chronological, I may take things slightly out of order in order to deal with them slightly more thematically. But early on in your cross-examination by Mr. Taylor, you were asked quite a lot of questions about noise levels being above Seoul, and it was put to you that, well, you should avoid noise levels above Seoul, and you explained on a number of occasions that you don't avoid the noise level above Seoul, you avoid the, under noise policy statement for England, you avoid the effect above Seoul, and then as part of the same theme, or same series of questions, there were questions about change, and changes in noise levels and EIA likely significant effects and so on. Can you just explain for the inspectors how these two things work together, the policy to avoid effects above Seoul and EIA, which is looking at obviously the effect of development and the significance of that effect. Just explain how those two things work.
So I think in general terms, obviously you're looking to avoid the absolute levels being above the Seoul, which in the context of airports normally means providing insulation where possible. And the change in noise level would be what's relevant in terms of what the effects of a development are, as in what the difference is with and without the development. Obviously, there may be some people who are unfortunately exposed to high noise levels in both cases.
Now, in that context, you were then taken to the tables in your proof of evidence. We could look at them in the environmental statement addendum, but just for convenience, we'll look at the numbers in the proof. So the proof pages 46 and 47, we'll look at those first, which is table 6 and table 7.
Yes.
And one of the things was put to you, taken to table 7, first of all, and the ESA, 10 million in 2030 versus 12 million in 2030, and you were invited to look at the numbers above Seoul, and you put to you, look, beneficial there's 0 and adverse there's 10. So let's just understand what those 10 are. Can you look at table 6, first of all? And we're looking at the ESA figure, so the bottom half of that table. Just explain to the inspector what the 10 are and how the 10 compares to the, in 12 MPPA, compares to the 10 MPPA case.
So, as you can see from table 6, there's around 10 properties that are above the Seoul in both the 10 and 12 million cases in 2030. And the difference for those dwellings would be a small increase in noise.
So I'll come to that, but both are above the Seoul in the 10 million case and the 12 million case. What does the MPSA say that one should do about the effects for such properties being above the Seoul?
You should try to avoid them.
And how, in relation to an airport, is that done?
In general terms, by insulating the property against noise.
Right. Now, in terms of understanding the effect of the development, what change the development makes, if we look at table 7, what does that tell us about the extent or degree to which the proposed development changes the position?
It tells us that they all experience a small increase of less than 1 decibel.
Right, and in the criteria of, you know, major, minor, and all those sort of things, is that level of change one that is significant.
No, it's not.
And why is that?
Because a level that would be regarded as significant would be one, if it's above the soul, would be greater than 2 decibel change.
Right. Now, if one wants to understand for that set of data, so all of those properties that one can see in Table 6, the ones above Lowell and the ones above Seoul, if one wants to understand the proportion of people who would be highly annoyed, can we look at Table 8? And again, we'll look at the bottom half of the table, the ESA data. We can see the numbers, and you've been taken to the numbers, but how are those numbers calculated? What's that based on?
So it's based on the research presented in SONA 2014, which gives an estimate of the percentage of people that would be highly annoyed at a series of different noise levels.
And so we can see that in order to understand the data, you can see the Seoul level, you can see the Lowell level, you can see the change, and you identify the number of people highly annoyed, and how is that data then used in terms of health?
I don't know specifically, but I understand it feeds into the health impact assessment.
Right, and we can pick that up with Mr. Piper. Let's do the same exercise for the nighttime, and we'll look in fact at 4 tables, I think, but let's look first at 2 of them, Table 9 and Table 10. So they're the sort of duplicate tables for the nighttime Lowell and Seoul. And again, on Table 9, you can see the numbers of dwellings above the Seoul, and it goes up from in 2017, 150, to 12 million 2030, 250, and 10 million 2030, 100. And again, what's the MPSE policy response to people that fall within that band?
So again, it would be to avoid those effects from occurring.
And you were taken to, I think, a section in the environmental statement that said that I think that contour is smaller than the daytime Seoul contour. Is that right?
It's smaller than the daytime 57 dB contour, which is the current threshold for the sound insulation scheme.
So with the properties within that above that nighttime Seoul, are they eligible for noise insulation?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we want to understand for those properties whether there has been a change, this is, I think, where we need to look at the erratum, isn't it? I think.
Yes.
Because some of the numbers were wrong, and so on page 50 we have the original table 10, but we need to note next to that there is an erratum table, and you set out in that erratum table the updated numbers. And again, we can look at the LOL as well if you want to. But if we look at the SOL, what is the scale of change for those 250 properties that we saw in Table 9, the 2030 12 MPPA properties?
So when comparing 10 and 12 million in 2030, most of them experience a 0 to 1 decibel increase, and some of them experience a 1 to 2 decibel increase, both of which are below the threshold of significance for change.
Thank you. And we've covered the point about noise insulation. Those are properties that are eligible for noise insulation. So Table 11, you present two additional pieces of data. This is the 90 dB cell and the 80 dB LAS max. Just touch on sort of tangentially. You've given the S max there. There's some debate about S max or slow max or fast max. I did touch on that with Mr. Fumicelli, but do you want to just comment on that briefly and why you have used slow?
I think, as Mr. Fumicelli said, the original reason for using slow max may have been due to limitations in measurement equipment that no longer exist, although the practice has continued for aircraft noise, and all of the research and indeed the standards that set out what metrics you should measure for an aircraft noise measurement system in ISO 20906 define that you should be measuring in terms of slow max. Obviously the the guidance in WHO 1999 relates to an internal level of fast max, because that's not only for aircraft noise, but in general the two seem to be broadly equated.
But for the purposes of UK policy standards and what we do, which is appropriate?
For the measurement and prediction of aircraft noise, slow max is the only one that's used.
So that data is presented, and then we come on to Table 12. And again, we'll perhaps focus on the second half of the table. And here, for each of the nighttime, again, scenarios, there is a calculation of the number of people highly sleep disturbed. And again, how is this calculated?
So it's a similar method. You take the number of people in each band of noise levels, so for example 45 to 50 or something, and multiply that by a percentage that are assumed to be highly sleep disturbed based on a dose response study.
And is there a different percentage for each band, including bands that go below SOL?
Yes.
And we can perhaps touch on that by looking at some of the sonar data in a minute, if that would be helpful. And I'm again taking it slightly out of order, but I'm just going to persist now by looking at the two tables, 14 and, sorry, not 14 and anything. I'm going to look at the rebuttal proof, your rebuttal proof. Pages 6 and 7, that's tables 1 and 2. And table 7, sorry, table 7, table 1 on page 6 looks at N70 numbers. And first of all, in relation to those, they give the numbers of dwellings above the N70 and then also the numbers of events. Now, is there any guidance in relation to this table as to what is a threshold, a change threshold of significance, i.e. EIA significance, the difference between the 10 million case and the 12 million case? Is there anything that tells us what is significant?
No, I'm not aware of anything for the change in the number of events that would indicate what is significant.
You made the point, in fact in your evidence in chief, but you were asked about it again in cross-examination, about actually this data is created based on exactly the same noise data that goes into the, in this case, the 16-hour LAQ and the same social survey data. And you made the point, well, in effect, it's telling us the same thing. Insofar as it is the two different matrices, the 16-hour LAQ and the N70 are trying to tell us the same thing, what does SONA tell us about which of them more accurately represents annoyance, for example?
I think while they both do correlate, it's clear that LEQ 16-hour correlates better with annoyance than N70 or N65. And therefore, SONA recommends that it's used for evidence-based assessments.
We talked before, when we looked at the LAQ 16-hour, and I asked you about how you'd come up with the highly annoyed numbers in your main proof table 8, and you explained to me that you use the sonar data to look at each noise band and then work out the percentage from the data that will be highly annoyed. Looking at this table, table 1 in your rebuttal, how would one understand from this the numbers of people that might be highly annoyed? Bearing in mind that it's not everyone, it's a percentage.
Yeah, it's not as concisely presented in the SONA report, although there are some relationships that you could use to estimate it.
And I want to come to that. In a little bit. And then if we look at the next table, N60, so table 2 in the rebuttal, again you were taken to the figures, and in effect it was put to you that the numbers of people, I think there was a figure that was used a number of times, and I'll forget precisely what it was 2,650 or something like that, as being the number of people highly sleep disturbed. First thing to ask in relation to the table at N60, are all of those people that appear in that table, i.e. above N60 and a number of events, are they all highly sleep disturbed?
No, obviously there's potential for sleep disturbance in that range,
right,
but not everybody will experience it. In fact, the majority probably won't.
Let's look then at the SONA data to try and get a little feel for this. So let's look at the SONA sleep disturbance study. So INQ 22. And before we go to the table I want to take you to, I'm going to take you to page 9. No, I'm not. I'm going to take you to page 10, PDF page 10. And we just need to note, don't we, in paragraph 2.20, it says there it's important to remember that self-reported sleep disturbance can result in overestimation compared to objective measures of changes to sleep stages and awakenings. And the next paragraph tells us that this report is an exploratory study, etc. So with those caveats in mind, let's go to page page 29. So with caveat that people tend to slightly over-report sleep disturbance, self-report, and it's an exploratory study, Table 16 at the bottom of that page looks at average summer night 8-hour numbers of events over 60 dB. It's an N60 table.
Yes.
And it then has, well, less than one event, or 1 to 9 event, or 10 to 19 events, or 20 to 29 events, 30 to 39 events, over 40 events, and then there's a total. Let's look at the total. We can break it down by numbers of events, but let's just look at the total, which is at the top of page 30. So overall, of people who experienced more than of N60 events, 51.7% of them were not at all sleep disturbed. 21.2% slightly, 12.5% moderately, and then you get to the two categories of highly sleep disturbed, 8.8% very, and 5.8% extremely. Now, I've taken the average there, and so the overall average of people highly sleep disturbed, of those experiencing an N60, is 9.3%. Now, obviously, there are variations, and one can see that those less than one event will somewhat skew the total. But one can get a feel there for numbers of people highly sleep disturbed. So is it accurate, is it helpful to simply look at your table 2 and see that as representing the number of people highly sleep disturbed?
No, it's not. I mean, I think as you point out, the total may be not necessarily representative because it includes some people that are exposed to less than one event, but of relevance in this table would be the row 20 to 29, which is the people that we were talking about, where you have 10.8% as highly sleep disturbed, so a minority.
And if we go back now to table 14, which is on page 27, and obviously this particular data has come out in this report from a couple of weeks ago. But when you were calculating your numbers of population highly annoyed, sorry, not population highly annoyed, population highly sleep disturbed in your table 12 of the main proof, and you said, well, look, I've applied different percentages for people within different noise bands. Is it using this type of approach where you get different percentages for different levels of noise?
Yes, it's this type of approach. I think for kind of approved dose response functions, it's a formula for a line on a graph and the values for that, rather than just literally the values of the results of a survey. But yes, it's the same kind of approach.
Now, in a context where SONA itself is telling us that the correlation with LAQ 8 hour is better than the correlation with N60. Is there any benefit, any logic in looking at your N60 data and applying all sorts of percentages to that to get numbers of people highly sleep disturbed, as opposed to doing what you've actually done, which is to look at the LAQ 16 hours and applying the percentages? So,
I don't believe so. I mean, as I said, they're trying to predict the same thing, and the conclusion of the SONA report is that LEQ 8 hour is the recommended one to use.
There was then a point, I think a minor point, but it was put to you in CD 413, the officer's report, that in some way it had said that there was no change between the two cases. Can we just look at what the data would have been available? So if we look at CD 2.5.16, and you turn in that to page 43, and table T 7.32, you get there the data that would have been available to officers, which we can see there, which are the same numbers which are in the top half of your table 6 in your proof. And what does that tell us about the number of dwellings above Seoul in the with and without case?
That it would remain largely unchanged.
Yeah, and so officers correctly reported the situation. Has that, for the above Seoul in daytime, has that changed?
No, there's similar results for the ES addendum.
If I move on now to a slightly different point, I can't promise to come back to some of those earlier themes. I've tried to gather up all those points together, but I might have missed them slightly. Yes, in the aviation policy framework, so CD 6.1, and you do seem to have spent rather a long time looking at this, but if we look at page 55, you were taken to the fair balance, and as a general principle, government expects future growth should ensure benefits are shared and reduce and mitigate those passages in paragraph 3.3. And then you were asked a lot of questions about, well, had the project been designed having regard to that. We can see what 3.3 says, but is there any requirement, so far as you're aware, to quantify the proportions of any sharing of benefit?
Not that I'm aware of.
And in paragraph 3.4, 7, a little bit further down, next page, you can see there what's called the ICAO balanced approach, identifying noise problem, assessing cost effectiveness of various measures to reduce noise through exploration of, and then 4 fairly well-known principles: reduction at source, land use planning, might come back to that for Mr. Morehouse's points, noise abatement, operational procedures, operating restrictions, so preventing noise during certain times, QC limits, that type of thing. Mr. Williams, in your view, to what extent has the proposed project and indeed the mitigation that's being proposed with it had regard to the broad principles of policy in terms of fair, balanced sharing benefits, the ICAO balanced approach?
I mean, clearly, there's reduction of noise at source, quieter aircraft is something that is happening. It's not something that is necessarily built into the project. It's just happening separately to it, as it were. Land use planning and management is not necessarily something that an airport can really control.
Just on that one, we had Mr. Morehouse's points and the 256, I think it was, additional properties that have been granted planning permission. What does that tell you about the local planning authority's view of the acceptability of additional dwellings within the proximity to the airport?
Assuming they've had proper regard to noise policy, you would imagine they think that the living conditions are acceptable if the dwellings are built as designed.
Yes. Noise abatement operational procedures, what sort of things are those?
So that's, for example, essentially aircraft operating in as quiet a manner as they can. So continuous descent approach profiles, for example, which means aircraft stay as high as they can for as long as they can before landing, and using minimum thrust needed for takeoff and things like that.
And operating restrictions, what sort of things are those as part of the balanced approach?
Obviously, as it says there, it relates primarily to preventing the noisiest aircraft from being able to fly, which is something that's already in place for Bristol, and they're obviously proposing to reduce the highest level of noise that's allowed for individual aircraft.
I just want to ask you, there was this sort of debate. Mr. Fumicelli made the point that one obviously needed to compare with what was permitted, and you were asked about that, and you said that this was consistent, your view was consistent with the APF. Can I just get you to go to page 61 in the APF and paragraph 3.29. This is on noise envelopes. Government wishes to pursue the concept of noise envelopes as a means of giving certainty to communities around the levels of noise which they can expect in the future, and give developers certainty on how they can use their airports. So how would you characterize the noise contour in the 10 MPPA case?
Well, in the context of this paragraph, a noise envelope could be considered to be a noise contour, yes.
Right, and then just before the bullet points, it says the government would determine principles for the noise envelope in the MPS, having regard to the following: government's overall noise policy, and within the limits set by the envelope, the benefits of future technological improvement should be shared between the airport and its local communities to achieve a balance between growth and noise reduction. So within the limits set by the envelope, what do you understand to be the appropriate approach when one is trying to look at the sharing of benefits.
Yes, I mean, as I think I said earlier, my interpretation is that essentially the limits imposed on the airport that currently exist should reduce as part of an application to expand. And that constitutes sharing the benefits.
Mr. Williams, a slightly sort of discrete small point that I just wanted to pick up. There was a debate about whether at night as I understand it, the lull should be set at 45 dB as opposed to 40 dB as indicated in the WHO report. Can we just, you made various comments about just how quiet that would be. Can we just go to the SONA report again, the INQ 22? And again, I think we're on page 9. In paragraph 2.18, which touches on this debate. So it says the WHO's view is that above 55 dB night, noise is a significant concern for public health. As a result, WHO set an interim target of 50 dB on night outside. For the longer term, it recommends that night noise exposure should be reduced below 40 dB on night outside. It is explained that the interim target is recommended in situations where the achievement of the night noise guidelines is not feasible in the short term for various reasons. With present technology, the achievement of 40 dB night target would require almost complete closure of all transport systems, including roads, railways and airports. The interim target is not a health-based limit value by itself, and vulnerable groups cannot be protected at this level. So what should the inspectors conclude about the appropriateness of setting a target at 40 dB?
Clearly it's not a realistic target for UK airports if the intention was not to have any people exposed to that level. I think also the fact that this guidance came out in 2009 shows that the government policy in 2017 clearly had regard for it when setting the policy at 45 dB.
And then there were some questions about whether or not it would be appropriate to set an ATM limit for the airport in order to control noise. We looked at, obviously, CD10 13. We've taken to that. Which is the aviation strategy, noise, forecast, and analyses. What does that document ultimately recommend as the appropriate strategy for setting a noise envelope?
So the document looked at a large number of different potential controls, including movement limits and passenger limits, as discussed earlier, but its ultimate recommendation is on page 66, which was, in summary, that airports should have a contour area limit and or a quota count limit. Sorry, not and, or.
So we can see that, so this talks about a national limit, but locally it says a locally set absolute quota count of noise contour area limit at a particular noise level for both day and night for each airport. And is what is proposed by Bristol Airport consistent with that advice?
Yes.
Sorry, I've been trying to keep all things together, but haven't totally managed. I've nearly come to the end, but I've noticed there was another sonar sleep disturbance point, another INQ 22 point that came up much later, and I haven't pulled that out. You made the point that the purpose of this study was to look to see if the LAQ 8-hour metric remained the most appropriate one, and we know what the conclusion was. Does INQ 22? You were then asked about thresholds for Seoul and Lowell and stuff. Does INQ 22 even use the term or mention Seoul?
No.
No. Is it purporting to set out some different threshold for Seouls for night time?
No, it makes no mention of what level would be regarded as a significant effect.
And then the last point with Mr. Taylor, he was asking you about the airport and what efforts the airport has made beyond planning conditions to control noise. Can we just look at CD 10.11? And this is the airport's noise action plan. It's the one from 1990 to 1919 to 2024. It's a 2018 document. If we look at section 6, for example, I don't have the PDF page number, I'm afraid, sorry. PDF page 26, there is there set out, it runs on for a number of pages, the airport's noise management framework and the various steps it is taking. I'm not going to be more dull than usual and go through it all, but perhaps just the inspector can look at that, but I'd perhaps just take you to page 28, for example. Bottom right-hand corner of page 28 is section 6.2.4, encouraging the use of quieter aircraft, aeronautical charges price differential, and it tells us there about the differential in charges for aircraft depending on various factors and the different fees paid to encourage them to be quieter, and also measures relating to night flying and other things. So, I'm not going to take you through all the details of that, but do airports, including Bristol Airport, have noise action plans?
Yes, they do. And
Yes.
right, clearly the paragraph you've pointed me to does encourage the use of quieter aircraft.
Okay, and as I say, I'm not going to take you through all the other bits, but there they are. And then we turn to Mr. Morehouse, who asked you a number of questions about arrivals, schedules, and an email from the airport about the number of flights during certain hours on a day in late July, I think in 2017, 18, I can't remember now. Is all that data, that type of data, reflected in firstly, the historic contours for any particular year? Does it include numbers of flights and movements and so on?
Yes, so for example, the 2017 contours that were produced include the flights that actually happened in 2017.
And similarly, the day contours and the night contours looking forward to 2030, do they reflect the numbers of flights, including flights during the night and the early mornings and so on?
Yes.
And when, perhaps it's a sort of final point, just worth understanding the way the social surveys work when they correlate community response with measurements of noise, including measurements of noise which are then averaged using LAQ. Can we just look at INQ 25? That's the second edition of Sonar. Just get you to, so this is the day noise and annoyance second edition document. And let's look at page 39. And you can see there, question can 1. This is an example of the social survey. So people sometimes say, well, this doesn't reflect my actual experience. So this is what people are. So thinking about this summer, because it's trying to reflect the 92-day summer period, when you were here at home, how much did each of these different types of noise from aeroplanes bother, disturb, or annoy you? And it asks then a sort of series of different questions. What then? How does Sonar? How do these other reports then use this data and the actual noise data around airports, which can be turned into an LAQ 16 or 8-hour metric? How do they use this sort of data to reflect the correlation between a representation of the actual noise and the way people responded to it?
So the Sonar study itself asked a number of people, I think nearly 2,000, of these types of questions in the vicinity of a number of different airports in the UK. and then looked at what the noise levels were for the immediately preceding summer, as in when they asked the questions.
So will the surveys reflect where people are who answered the survey and in a particular area or community, and the amount of noise that was actually being experienced by that community?
Yes.
And will some of the survey areas be closer to or further away from airports, or close to busier airports or quieter airports?
Yes, they selected the survey locations to try and cover a broad range of daytime noise levels.
And so how does it then work? You have different people who've experienced different types or levels of noise, from people perhaps very close to Heathrow to other people who are a long way away from a smaller airport. How do they fit all that together to create a correlation?
Obviously, they aggregate all of the responses so they plot them all on a graph and try and come up with a dose response curve, essentially.
And when Sonar is telling us that the best relationship between the answers to all those types of questions and a representation of noise is LAQ 16 hour and LAQ 8 hour, is that the relationship that is being examined in that data?
Yes, so what they're finding is it correlates the best with what people have actually said in surveys.
One final point, Ms. Tudor, I don't know how far I've gone over my 45 minutes. Have I gone badly over?
No, you're 8 minutes over. So.
8 minutes over. One final point, you were asked by Ms. Tudor about the AONB, and you made the point that, well, there wouldn't be very much noise. Perhaps to help the inspector, it might be useful if we try and show a representation of the AONB and then a representation of the contours. So a representation of the AONB boundary, we need CD 2.5.23. Yes, of course. I'm so sorry. CD 2.5.23. And the particular plan there is not a noise plan, it's a landscape plan, but it shows the boundary of the AONB. So we can see there in orange, south of the airport, the boundary of the AONB, and perhaps a useful way to understand it is it just includes the Chew Valley Lake, and it also just includes, just goes around to the north of Blagdon Lake, and you can see where it is generally then in relation to those two large sort of physical features. And then if we look at the noise contours, and we look at CD 2.20.4, and we go, I think, to page 53.
So, what page are you disappearing off the mic a bit?
Sorry.
So, what CD and what
it's
page?
CD 2.20.4.
Yep.
And it's PDF page 23. And you can see there for, oh, sorry, that's actually not the best one because that's an 8 hour. Yeah, sorry, page 50. Sorry, I just pulled up a less good page. So PDF page 50. And if we remember that the northern boundary of the AONB just goes around the north of Chumagna Lake and Blagdon, and we can see there the contours going down to the 51 contour. So again, perhaps you can just explain to the inspector, when you said that the levels of noise there were low. I lost you in terms of the plans.
No? Just, yeah, trying to find the right thing.
Don't think you're on the right one. I've got.
No,
It's.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just explain to the inspector what that shows, and I, in a very crude way, I tried to sort of give an indication of where the AONB boundary was. So just explain what that shows in terms of the contours, and also, you know, in terms of change, what sort of change there would be.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's a long way outside of the noise contours that we've produced. And as mentioned earlier, there's no reason to expect that the change in areas further away from the airport would be different to that we have assessed. I was just trying to locate the note that we did for NSC, which is CD 3.4.6, I think. On page 26. But we estimated that it would be in the region of 35 decibels, head 60 an hour in that area.
Thank you. And I think those are the only points I've got, so thank you, Madam.
Okay, thank you very much. It's 4 o'clock. I know we said we'd do air quality today, but I think it's been quite a long day, so we'll leave it there. We do have time this week, particularly with the PCAA not cross-examining in terms of health on Thursday, so we're comfortably in this week. We'll get everything done for Thursday, and then Friday will just be conditions.
Can I ask you, Madam, on Friday, how do you intend to handle it? Is it a sort of general discussion between the parties? It's presumably not calling evidence or, you know, the witnesses or anything of that sort.
No, it's obviously it's a round table session, so to be led by myself and Mr. Young. Obviously, given the nature of and the technical nature of the conditions, we will be seeking sort of advocate input as well as the witnesses to guide us in that, but it will be led by us.
This is really just a question of us understanding who needs to be there. One of the key people from the airport who would be there for personal reasons is not, unfortunately, able to be there on Friday, so we'll probably be able to field someone else. We weren't sure whether Mr. Williams should be here or whether he should be virtual. Is this something where you will be wanting to ask the witnesses questions, and so it would be useful he's here, or?
We will be wanting to answer ask the technical witnesses questions, but if that's physical or virtual, I'm easy.
You're
so if you
that.
want to go back home and do it from the comfort of your home office, that's absolutely fine. Obviously, slight drawbacks with body language, etc., but it seems to be working very well, so that's fine. And Mr. Fiemancelli was obviously virtual and probably still is, I assume.
He still is
still
virtual.
in the Premier.
Is he still stuck in the
Still in the
Premier
Premier
Inn? I
Inn.
hope not.
I think he is still, yes, that's what I heard. But in any event, he was intending to appear virtually. So.
Okay, yeah. So that doesn't bother, you know, if Mr. Williams wants to be at home, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, well, I mean, it may be, we'll decide, but we just wanted to try and get a feel for what you wanted, really.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Can I just add to the discussion just briefly, if I may? I'm assuming that this is a sort of first round of discussion, and that
Yes.
we're going to be encouraged to continue discussions outside of the inquiry.
Absolutely. I
and we
was
can
going
revisit
to
later.
go over all that at the start, but it's, you know, it's obviously a very focused session. I just thought, while we had the witnesses here, be useful. But of course, you know, it's going to be quite a few weeks before we actually do the rest of the conditions, and if anything changes, then we're absolutely thrilled if there's any agreements, hopefully, hint, hint. So, and I know, is there a meeting going on this week between the parties in terms of noise?
I think there's one on Thursday morning. Obviously, you know, a slight limitation has been witnesses
Absolutely,
doing
yeah.
other things, but
The
I think
evidence
there's one
is
on
getting in the
Thursday.
way.
Exactly. So that's all useful. So thank you.
Okay,
Thank
and
you
is
for
that because obviously the PCAA had their own sort of particular points on conditions as well? So I don't know if they're involved in the meeting, but if they can be briefed on it after and any points taken, just make sure you include them in your discussions as well, just to assist us. And obviously on Thursday, if there's an update, if there's changed draft conditions, can you let me know so I'm not up till midnight revising, please? Okay, that's helpful, thank you. Just a couple of other points then. So last week I asked for the factual note on the percentages in relation to noise, and there's been a note sent round today via Ms Vincent. It was a little bit more involved than I thought, but it does obviously set out the background to that.
Yes, I think, I mean, it sort of shows the working, if you like, but it comes up with the answer at the end that this is the note about different fleet mix and what it would do for air quality and what it would do for air noise, and I think it gives you it just gives you the answer. It wasn't meant to do anything more than that, and just explain.
Yeah, and the PCAA, you've seen that? Yeah, okay, great.
I've seen it as well.
You've seen it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing you did ask for, and it's on our action list, following a question I asked Mr. Vaughan, was percentage changes in ATMs between the different scenarios. And just to let you know, we have got that on the action list, and we haven't forgotten about it, but I'm not sure to what extent it's sort of essential for anything that you're going to do, but people are getting on with it.
Okay, that's coming. Excellent, thank you. And then we've had in the same email with the noise note, there's an air quality note submitted again relating to the fleet mix. I presume all parties have seen that and content that that's...
It's just answering the question that you asked.
Yeah.
In a little bit more detail than I think you were expecting.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. Okay, we'll get those on as inquiry documents then. And then the other outstanding issue on my list is the coordinated airport note. Again, just a factual note, just setting out what that is, so we're 100% clear on that.
Exactly, the person who was doing that is the person who's not been able to be at work for a few days, and so we're getting someone else to do that.
So that, yeah, it's not dropped off the bottom of the list.
It's not dropped off the bottom of the list.
That's great, thank you.
I think the intention was that we try and agree that if we can.
Yes.
So
Yeah, that's...
I appreciate the difficulties, but
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, any other procedurally points before we... I don't know if procedurally is a word, but hey, it's 4 o'clock. Any other points to raise today?
No, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your input today, and we will reconvene tomorrow at 9:30 for air quality. Thank you.